Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ and Friends. Today is the second Wednesday of the month, which means it's time to hammer your way to health with none other than the co-founder of the TrueNorth Health Center and the author of Can Fasting Save Your Life? And the co-author of The Pleasure Trap, Dr. Alan Goldhamer, who is here to answer your questions. Please welcome him back. Hi, Dr. Goldhamer. How are things?
Hello, AJ.
So how are things at the TrueNorth Health Center?
Well, they're busy. We've been able to acquire an additional building, and so we've been renovating that. And so we're very excited. I think they're going to be painting it Monday, so pretty soon it'll be up and working. So it's always exciting when we're able to renovate some of our space.
Well, how many more patients will you be able to accommodate then?
Well, as of January, we expect to have 7 additional patient bedrooms altogether. We've gotten some additional buildings, and we're also doing some pretty major renovation of our landscaping. We're putting in this edible landscaping theme throughout. There's
Well,
actually 11 buildings that make up the campus, and so each of those have yards and whatnot, and we're integrating all of those. So we're putting in more fruit trees, persimmons and citrus and all kinds of stuff that we're able to grow there, and making it the outdoor space more comfortable. You saw that when you were there recently, where the courtyard was kind of renovated and made so it's more of a social space.
what I love about going there is it's like going to summer camp.
Yeah. Well, I call it the prison camp, but I guess summer camp would be a more politically correct term.
Right, but it's only prison camp during the fast. Once you're feeding, it's really like a
Yeah.
vacation.
Yeah, it's definitely more fun to feed than it is to fast. No question about that.
Absolutely. Well, I got a lot of puzzles done while I was there.
Is that right?
We had a lot. It's so fun because when you go there, I had no idea. I mean, there were 10 people that I knew really well, just that coincidentally were there at the same time.
Well, don't you think it's not just coincidental? Because a lot of the people that come there are people that heard about it from Chef AJ.
But I didn't know they were going to be there that week, if you know what I mean. So that was really fun. And
I think pretty much we always have people that know Chef AJ there, AJ.
yeah. Well,
I
I
don't
do
think
want,
that's
I don't know if people realize that they can get some of the experience of True North simply by creating a free account for True North TV at healthpromoting.com. And you are so generous, you just for free live stream. They're not recorded, but if they can watch during the time, you live stream all the lectures.
Yeah, we do live stream the lectures. We also have a Roku channel that we're going to be working on uh, upgrading, which also is a no-cost access for recorded video. So we are this next year we're planning to put a lot of effort into upgrading our live streaming. We're getting upgraded camera and sound systems, and we're going to be developing a lot more content for the Roku channel because we try to increase our educational outreach. We've been doing a lot more remote fasting supervision for people that are good candidates and then aren't able to come to the center. We've got doctors that'll work with a patient's local doctor so that they can do care from home. And so we're trying to upgrade the educational outreach, not just for our patients staying at the center, but also for the patients that are working with us remotely.
That is so cool. Because in general, you don't really recommend people do water fasts at home, maybe, long term,
There
especially.
are some patients that are decent candidates for that if they're willing to rest, maintain hydration, and get appropriate monitoring from their local doctor in terms of lab and testing. We do have doctors like Dr. Wise who will work with people remotely if they're a good candidate. So, not everybody's a good candidate for fasting. Not everybody's a good candidate for home fasting. But if you are a good candidate, that is an option that we've been trying to develop
Right. But you recommend everybody fast every night after dinner till breakfast,
every day.
every day, at least.
Don't eat 4 hours before you go to bed, and that'll give you somewhere between 12 and 16 hours of fasting every day. And that little bit of fasting every day cumulatively is thought to provide some significant benefits, not the least of which by not eating 3 to 4 hours before to bed, you don't end up with eating a bunch of stuff that turns into fat. You don't have your sleep disrupted. You're not having to wake up to empty your bladders because you can empty your bladder before you go to bed. And it gives you that 12-hour fasting window so that when you wake up in the morning, especially if you can maybe get some exercise going in the morning, you can maximize your fat loss and give your body a chance to maintain health.
Is there any benefit for the average person without medical problems to just fast 1 day a week, or is that not really
Well,
necessary?
we'd recommend 16 hours every day, not just 1 day a week, but every single day. Do a 16 hours of fast, up to 16 hours of fasting. Once you get over 16 hours, AJ, you've depleted your glycogen stores. You start getting into more gluconeogenesis, more of the breakdown of lean tissues. So what we recommend is a 16 up to 16 hours every day, and then occasionally there may be, if it's appropriate, a longer period of fasting, and that could range anywhere from 2 to 40 days.
Wow, I am astounded at the people I saw there. One lady, she's like on day 33 and she's walking around like with
Yeah.
energy and vitality. I mean,
Yeah.
after 3 days, I'm like, you know,
Yeah, well, you're also already at target weight and stuff, so you don't have extra reserves to be doing 33-day fasting.
it's still amazing. So we've got a bunch of questions sent in by our viewers. Thank you guys for the questions, and please go to chefaj.com to send your question. So we'll get started. This one's very specific from Jared, and Jared asks about something you spoke about. He said, in a recent lecture, you mentioned grade 4 adverse events at True North that were caused by a history of GLP-1. What percentage of the 0.1% had a history of GLP usage?
Well, when that study was done on our safety study, they were not using those GLP inhibitors for weight loss. So I don't think that we have an accurate assessment in that. What I can tell you, though, is that now we're seeing a shocking increase in complications that are seem to be more common in people that have used those medications, and particularly involving trying to maintain electrolyte balance. Uh, it's been it's definitely, obviously it's a little early to tell yet, but there definitely seems to be problems from people that are using those meds. We have to have extra diligence and vigilance. We're also seeing problems very much more frequently now from people that are having untoward reactions to COVID vaccine. And it turns out it's not necessarily the first exposure, but the repeat exposure. And now there's evidence that healthcare workers have significantly higher risk, and it may be because they're more, being forced to get more frequent boosters. So there's some concern that there are vulnerable people, particularly with history of autoimmune disease and cancer, that don't do well with repeat exposure. We've also recently published a paper on the successful treatment of long COVID with fasting. About 10% of the people that experience COVID infection um, have residual symptoms like lack of taste or smell or brain fog, fatigue, etc. And we just published a paper that on a person who had a 2-year history of hell after having had COVID, who did remarkably well after a couple weeks of fasting. And we're actually should be publishing a case series on these conditions. So fortunately, fasting seems to be helpful in getting the body to reboot after long COVID, as well as patients that have experienced COVID vaccine injury.
Huh. Have you ever gone to like, I don't know if you've ever rented like a cabin Big Bear and Airbnb, but like they have this guest book that people sign and just say, oh, I was here and I really like this about your cabin. It'd be kind of cool if like you had every patient do that, because I'm seeing things on the chat of people that had such tremendous benefit from True North. So for example, Lila, who's watching, she said, I no longer have fibromyalgia after fasting at True North 2 years ago. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, fibromyalgia is another one of those conditions that, it's complicated. It's difficult to know exactly what the contributing factors are, but many patients that have suffered long histories with this condition will respond to fasting, and we don't know the explanation about exactly what changes are taking place, but it's certainly gratifying to see these patients' stories and experiences.
Nice. Okay, so here's a great general question that MCAT is posting. How does one know if they are a good candidate for fasting?
Well, there's a couple things you can do. If you read our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, you'll know probably more than you want to know about fasting. And that book is designed to help patients understand fasting, but also patients help patients' doctors understand it. So it has a lot of very detailed information in terms of how to evaluate a patient, lab testing, how to interpret it. The other thing you can do is you can go on to our website and complete the registration forms at TrueNorthHealth.com, and we offer a free phone conversation with me, and I'll tell you whether or not you're a candidate to consider fasting or not. And there's no cost for that. I'll review your medical history, and we can talk about, pointing you in the right direction.
Perfect. Thanks.
But I can tell you in general, there's some things to think about. The people that respond best to fasting are people that have conditions that are associated with dietary excess. So people that have obesity and the diseases associated with that, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and some forms of cancer, including lymphoma, respond remarkably well to fasting. If you look at our website, you can see the 22 papers we've published, including conditions like chronic fatigue and long COVID, problems with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, difficulties, with a variety of conditions. And there are case reports, there are case series, and there are actually clinical trials as well. The conditions that are caused by people eating too much and getting fat, of which about 10% is visceral fat. That visceral fat is pro-inflammatory. It gives off metabolic products that cause those diseases, not surprisingly, respond to fasting, because fasting preferentially mobilizes visceral fat. And so you get rid of the fat, you get rid of the inflammation, the body heals itself, and then we, work diligently to try to take credit for it.
Did you always know that fasting preferentially mobilized visceral fat, or is that something you
I
learned?
did not, AJ. We didn't know that till we got that DEXA scanner in and did that study. And we looked at, and it was very surprising, actually. For example, in a patient that fasted for 2 weeks on average, that lost 10% of their total weight, lost 20% of their total fat, but 40% of their visceral fat. So that was really interesting. And it made sense, though, because if you go on a fast until you have a breast tumor and you lose 10% of your body weight, you won't necessarily lose 10% of your breast tumor. You might lose 40% of your breast tumor or more. So the body seems to have some ability to preferentially mobilize, but we don't always know when or how it's going to do it. So sometimes people have lesions and they don't go away, something else gets worked on. So, we don't always get to have our say in what goes first. It's the same thing with weight loss. Many women notice that the weight they want to lose the most isn't necessarily the first weight that comes off.
When people regain their weight, whether they lost it through water fasting or taking, Ozempic, when they gain it back, are they gaining visceral or subcutaneous or both?
Right. So what happens when you go on a fast, you lose weight, which is made up of water, glycogen, protein, fiber, and fat and protein. So protein, fat, water, fiber, and glycogen. When you come off the fast, if you're eating a whole plant food SOS-free diet, you will gain water, fiber, glycogen, and protein, but not fat. The fat continues to come off. And we were able to prove that. And if you look at our body composition studies on our website, you can see we're able to prove that using the DEXA scanner, that you don't regain fat, you continue to lose fat following a healthy diet, but you do regain your water, fiber, glycogen, and protein. So if you let's say you lose 20 pounds of total weight during fasting, you'll gain maybe 10 pounds of that water, fiber, glycogen, and protein back afterwards and continue to lose fat. So the fat continues to come off, even while your scale weight is going up.
Sounds good. Thank you. Here's a question submitted by Sarah. On the last episode, Dr. Goldhamer, you had mentioned having a sprouts business with Dr. Lisle. What did your sanitation process consist of?
Yeah, well, that was interesting because the way the business worked is we would soak the seeds, the organically grown seeds, after they were rinsed in a 5-gallon buckets. And then we would place those in sterilized grow trays that would hold 4 pounds of finished product. They would be placed on fiberglass racks that have been, cleaned with bleach, and they would be under grow lights. And we had, 800 square feet of racking, and they would automatically water, And then afterwards, those racks would be placed in plastic bags, and then they would be stacked in the refrigerator and distributed. So it's a really efficient system. We're doing several thousand pounds a week of sprouts. Interesting, the only cleaning agents that are used is really bleach and water, and manual scrubbing of those brushes. Now, uh, the if you think about sprouts, it's very much like any agricultural product. It's a living product. What you don't want are molds, rhizobius molds, and we figured out that the temperature which those sprouts sporulate. So we kept the warehouse a couple degrees below that level, and so we basically eliminated spoilage, which really changed that business model because that was one of the big problems with sprout houses. They would get mold and have spoilage problems where we basically eliminated that.
Nice. Do you miss the old business?
No, it was a lot of work. Those are it's like 7 days a week. They have to be rinsed regularly. You have to do everything right, or you lose your crop. So I don't miss that at all. In fact, when we sold that business, the people that bought that business, the money that was raised was used to purchase the original TrueNorth Health Center. So that business not only put me through school, but it also helped us get the seed money that we needed in order to start the TrueNorth Health Center. So I'm grateful for it, but I'm glad not to be having to do that
Isn't
twice a
that
day,
isn't that
or
funny
three
that
times a day, every day. Yeah.
isn't that funny that the selling of seeds is what gave you the seed money?
Yeah, the seed money from the seeds. I was just thinking about that. It was kind of like having a baby, where you got to feed them and care for them and all that stuff. And I was thinking about an expression I heard people say, "Oh, he slept like a baby." Those are people that never had babies, because if you've ever had babies, sleeping like a baby means you wake up every hour crying.
That's funny. Okay. Next question is from Suzanne, who says she's been diagnosed with mast cell activation syndrome, and the
Yes.
recommendation is to eat a low histamine diet. That's a lot of the foods that she eats on the whole food plant-based diet. What is your opinion?
Well, my approach to mast cell activation syndrome is a little bit different. What we do is supervised fasting, and then we follow fasting with a whole plant food SOS-free diet. Now, there may be some foods people are sensitive to, and high histamine foods may be an issue for some people. But after fasting, many people are able to eat a variety of whole plant foods without activating that system, and so. That would be something she might want to consider to determine if she's a candidate for medically supervised water-only fasting, and perhaps we can get even better control uh, of
Right.
that condition.
There's a question, where do you get your iodine?
So there's a number of sources of iodine. Vegetable materials that are grown on soil that are adequate in iodine have iodine. So if you have food that's grown on the coast of the country, you're likely to get iodine. But if you lived in Minnesota soil, since it's never been covered by the oceans, is going to be deficient in iodine. So unless the soil is fortified with iodine, the plants may not have adequate iodine, because iodine is not needed by land plants in order to survive. So unlike most minerals where the plants have to have minimum levels, iodine, zinc, are examples of nutrients that may not be necessary for the plant. So I buy a food that is grown on iodine adequate soil, and most people do as well. But you can also fortify your food with a bit of sea vegetable materials. You can include some low sodium nori sheets or a little bit of wakame or kelp. And that's another rich source of trace minerals, including iodine. Or you could supplement iodine. If iodine was a concern, you can do supplementation of iodine.
But you don't supplement during a fast, because the same person's asking, like, when you fast, do you take your B12 or other supplements or
No.
electrolytes, for example?
No, during fasting, you're on water only, not taking supplements. It's actually an important consideration for a number of reasons, not the least of which is we allow the minerals that are rate limiting, that we're monitoring, be rate limiting nutrients. You wouldn't want to just say supplement potassium if your potassium went low, because the other things you're not able to monitor uh, could also be allowed to continue. So one of the ways to make fasting safe is by avoiding supplementation during fasting. Body does a really good job of recycling. If you're adequate when you start the fast, you should let whatever the rate limiting nutrient is be the rate limiting nutrient.
Thank you. And he's also saying in older videos, you wore glasses. You don't wear them anymore. Did you get laser surgery? And what are your thoughts
No,
on
I didn't.
laser surgery?
I didn't get laser surgery, and I still wear glasses, but I don't need glasses. As my eyes have changed, I don't need glasses for near vision. I need glasses for far vision. So if you notice me speaking at lectures where there's like a monitor or something, I'll wear glasses because I can't see, far away. But my eyes are good for close. Close is okay, just not far.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to get some questions in the chat. The first one is from Linda. Does fasting for older patients over 70 cause additional muscle mass loss?
Doesn't cause additional muscle mass loss, but everybody that fasts loses some lean tissue. What's exciting, though, is in that same study I was mentioning to you before about body composition, we noticed that in that same study where people lost 40% of their visceral fat, they lost 6% of lean tissue. But by the end of 6 weeks, all 6% had been fully replenished and then some, such that the percentage of body mass from lean tissue was actually higher at 6 week follow-up than it was at baseline. So yeah, you lose some lean tissue, but we've learned a way to minimize the protein loss during fasting, and that's with something called rest. When people are more active in fasting, they lose more weight, but that weight is not fat, it's protein. So by getting people to rest during fasting and not be overly active, we minimize the lean tissue loss and maximize lean tissue recovery after fasting with a healthy whole plant food SOS-free diet.
Perfect. Okay. Got a question from Arlene. Do you ever get any athletes fasting, and how would it affect their strength and endurance?
Yes, we get a lot of athletes over the years that have used fasting, and for various issues, including injury recovery, et cetera. And short term, of course, it takes about the length of the fast to recover from the fast and get your full strength back and everything. And so you don't want to do it necessarily a prolonged fast, and then plan an intense exercise activity like a marathon or something like that. You want to make sure you always have recovery time that's appropriate so that your athletic performance is going to be accentuated rather than suppressed.
Perfect. There's a question from Rachel. Can diet and fasting alone help with adrenal issues and hormonal imbalances?
Well, it certainly can. And what's really exciting is there's a wide variety of conditions, like, for example, fibrocystic breast disease and dysmenorrhea and menorrhagia and polycystic ovarian syndrome and uterine fibroid tumors. And there's just a number of these conditions that women experience. I have a theory, I can't prove it yet, but I believe that one of the problems is that estradiol, the active estrogen hormone, doesn't convert to estriol effectively. Estriol is excreted in the urine. And the thing that breaks estradiol to estriol down is the microbiome, the gut organisms that live in your gut and your liver function. The microbiome and liver function are profoundly affected by fasting. And we can talk about that, but the net effect is that the women that have these symptoms, not necessarily by the first cycle, but by the second cycle post-fasting, often have profound improvements in these conditions with PCOS and fibroid formation, the menorrhagia, the dysmenorrhea, et cetera. And I think that may be one of the mechanisms by which fasting is having such a profound benefit. The other thing we've noticed that's happened a number of times is people whose tubes are good, their plumbing's good, but they're not getting pregnant for unknown reasons, come in and fast, and within a month or two are pregnant. And so whether it's the rest or the fast, we don't know for sure, but it definitely seems to be a useful tool for people that can't understand why they're having trouble getting pregnant. Sometimes that experience has been successful in helping reestablish their fertility function.
Great, thank you. And can you lose lipomas after fasting?
Well, when you lose weight, you lose fat, and when you lose fat, lipomas get smaller. I don't know that lipomas are preferentially mobilized during fasting. I don't know that the body sees them as a big threat. So some lipomas do go away in fasting, but it's not universal. And sometimes people fast and lose weight, but we don't see necessarily a change in a particular lymphoma. What does go down, though, is often the pain associated with some lipomas, depending on where they're located, if there's an inflammatory component. Inflammation definitely goes down in fasting.
Perfect. Sue says, hello, I eat a lot of white rice. Do I need to be concerned about arsenic?
Well, white rice or brown rice, arsenic is the natural part of the soil in small quantities, but in soils that have been sprayed with chemical pesticides, especially soils where they raise cotton, they tend to have high arsenic levels. Well, rice of any kind, the way it's grown, it soaks in water, it absorbs a higher proportion of that arsenic than maybe some other plants might. So if the soil has been contaminated with high levels of arsenic, the rice will have higher levels of arsenic than would be normal. So the things you can do, well, number one, I wouldn't recommend white rice. I'd recommend eating brown rice. Brown rice has it's not a refined carbohydrate. It's got the hull, the nutrients, the fiber that make it more nutritious, slow down the glycemic response, etc. I would also buy organically grown rice, preferably on soils that were not used to raise cotton previously. We buy our rice from a company called Lundberg Farms in California. They grow certified organically grown rice, and they publish the arsenic levels of their rice. They do analysis, and so you can see whether the levels are normal background levels or elevated levels. And there's a couple things. So that's number one thing I'd buy. That California brown rice probably has lower levels than maybe some of the East Coast rice where they're raising it on cotton, fields. Second thing is, if you're concerned about arsenic levels, you can cook your rice like you would pasta, 5-to-1 water instead of 2-to-1, and there'll be significantly lower levels residual. Now, it'll also flush some of the other positive nutrients, but it would be a way of continuing to use rice, but with lower levels of concern there. The people that probably should be most worried about things like arsenic, though, are people eating things like chicken and stuff, and the animal products where it's biologically concentrated. But somehow that never gets discussed. But I guess any kind of attack on sprouts or brown rice or something that has a health food connotation or sounds like it comes from California seems to be the favorite attack site for some people in the media today.
Perfect. Hey, this is a really fun question I see from a live viewer named Denise. If you fast at True North, then leave and gain the weight back eating junk, is it worse for you than never fasting at all, or do you still maintain some of the health benefits?
Well, that's a good question. It turns out it's almost frustrating because some of our patients that do really well and then maybe slip off track, the disadvantage is they continue to often feel well even as they're gaining their fat back. The symptoms don't just come back right away. And so if the symptoms would come back right away, we'd get better adherence because they'd realize every time they eat crap, they feel crappy. But sometimes they continue to feel good and then they think they can get away with it until eventually it blows up again. The exception to that are patients with autoimmune diseases, which is why I like patients with autoimmune disease so much, because oftentimes they're very sensitive. If they start eating the gluten or the dairy, whatever, they'll get the bleeding or the pain. And so it kind of keeps them in line. So I kind of like patients that have conditions that don't allow them to cheat because we get better long-term results. But unfortunately, as the body gets well, its tolerances often go up. And so people are able to get away with stuff for a while, and so it may backfire on them that way.
Thank you.
I tell you, AJ, if we were doing research on rodents, it would be no trouble because you just put the rodents in the cage, you give them the test environment, and that's it. And they live their life out, in that environment. But humans insist on going home. And so, I've been trying, originally I thought, well, why don't we just keep them all there and don't let them go home? But apparently that's like politically incorrect and not practical. So
I didn't
we're
want to.
stuck with this idea of people having to live free living in the real world, and it's very difficult.
Well,
Adopting a health promoting diet in a world designed to make you fat, sick, and miserable is perhaps one of the most difficult challenges I think people face in their lifetime. It's very hard to overcome all those social roadblocks and energy vampires and all the forces of evil that are trying to get you to go along and get along, and rather than do the right thing.
I didn't want to go home.
Yeah, but you're an exception.
That's funny. Okay. Gabriella would like to know, is there anything you recommend for menopause and particularly water retention?
Yeah, so water retention is often aggravated by these hormonal imbalances we talked about that also make menopausal symptoms so much more severe. What's remarkable about patients on a whole plant food SOS-free diet that exercise and get enough sleep, and if necessary, use fasting, is they often go through menopause with dramatically less debilitating symptoms than those that don't. And again, I think that's one of the estradiol, estriol hormone balance, issues. Um, so the things that seem to help with menopause are maintaining optimum weight, engaging in exercise enough but not too much, trying to get adequate sleep, and also stress mediation. I think people underestimate the effect of stress. When you think about stress and stress hormones, those are designed to occasionally come up in life-threatening situations to motivate you to be able to, run away or do what you need to do. But we're putting ourselves in artificially high stress situations every day, like driving an automobile. I mean, think about that. You're going 50, 60 miles an hour in this little metal ball with people next to you also driving 2,000-pound vehicles that are like reading the paper while they're driving or texting or eating or putting on their makeup. And you see that, and subconsciously you realize that that idiot could very easily kill you. And for some reason, that makes people a little bit stressed. People drive 2 hours a day to get to a job they hate and work with people they don't like for a company they despise to make things they don't believe in because they think the only way to get happy is to engage in short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior because they don't differentiate happiness from pleasure. And so they're just in a constant short-term pleasure-seeking mode, hoping that if they could just get enough pleasure, they'd get happy. But if you ask any drug addict, you ask anybody addicted to cocaine, yeah, they can get a lot of pleasure from inducing it artificially with cocaine, but they're not going to get happy. I don't know if I've ever met a drug addict that's overall balance of life is perceived as highly positive by them. They're not happy.
Yep, agreed. Oh, here is a great question from Rondi. She said that she lost over 200 pounds. Congratulations, she's been on the show and maintained it for 8 years now, following a whole food plant-based lifestyle, and is a generally healthy individual who still sometimes struggle with sugar and sugar substitute addiction. She'd contacted True North in 2022 and had an initial call with you, but personal circumstances at the time didn't allow her to arrange a stay. She says since that time, she managed to kick the diet soda addiction that was plaguing her and has done multiple longer 24 to 36-hour fasts and one 72-hour fasts. And what she says is I always find I'm unable to sleep well with any fast longer than 24 hours and just assumed that was part of the fasting process. However, I recently chose to wear a continuous glucose monitor temporarily just for informational purposes. And on my last fast, I noted that my blood sugar was quite low, down to 54 milligrams per deciliter when I was struggling to sleep. I ate a few dates and it came back to a normal range, peaking at about 90 milligrams per deciliter, and I was able to get some sleep.
Yep.
Is this normal during a longer fast, or is this evidence of metabolic dysfunction as a result of having been obese for 30 years? How low should a healthy person allow their blood sugar to go during longer fasts?
Right. So fasting blood sugars will drop down lower because you're changing your fuel from burning glucose to burning ketones, which is a byproduct of fat metabolism. And specifically, your brain is going to start burning beta hydroxybutyric acid, but it takes a while for that transition to take place. That's the difficult part of fasting, and that's between day 2 and day 5. Once people get into fasting, then it gets much easier because your brain converts to burning fat and it stops signaling the body that you're dying because your blood sugars are too low. And for people that are not on medications, if diabetes is not an issue that we're talking about, generally blood sugar levels will stay in the 45 to 65 range during fasting. If they get too low, you can get symptoms like numbness or even orthostatic hypotension and all kinds of untoward symptoms. If that happens, sometimes we do have to put people on juices for a couple of days to stabilize them, and then we can often go back into the fasting mode. But it's also one of the reasons why fasting is best done under supervision, and particularly for people that have had anybody that's on medications or anybody that has significant medical history, being in a controlled and contained environment can be very helpful. Sometimes people will, if they're too active in fasting, they'll get hypoglycemic crisis, or they'll get atrial fibrillation or tachycardia, or worse. So dehydration is also an issue. So appropriate monitoring is necessary in fasting. That's why even for people that are going to be fasting at home, the parameters are still the same. History exam, lab monitoring to make sure you're a good candidate, rest during fasting, hydration, and then careful refeeding. And so a patient at home is still going to need the benefits of their doctor for examination and evaluation and support. And even though we might be able to provide remote support and encouragement, they still need a doctor there to help them. It's a very vigorous process, and even though it can be done safely and effectively, people shouldn't underestimate how vigorous this process is, and particularly for people that haven't induced those enzyme system with daily intermittent fasting and periodic longer term fasting.
Thank you.
You notice, AJ, when you were at the center, the people that fast regularly have much easier time than people that maybe they're new to fasting. Some of our patients have been fasting once a year for 30, 35 years. And so even though they're in advanced age, they still can fast very easily. Or somebody maybe hasn't had the benefit of that, wouldn't necessarily have as easy a time. So there's a training effect, just like in exercise. If I take a person that's never exercised and I say, let's go out and run a marathon, that may not always be such a good thing. But if you have a person that's training and running every day, their ability to do that may be much better. And so there is a training effect that occurs with this fasting response, and it has to be respected. You don't want to have people do more than is appropriate.
Thank you. My blood sugar got down to 46.
Yeah, well, that's just above once it gets to 45 or below, that's what we call a glucose alert, and then we have a different level of monitoring. But again, you're an unusual person who's coming in already at target weight, so I don't know that we can count you as being normal. In fact, not even remotely close to being normal. You're a total mutant. What can I say?
Thank you so much for the compliment. Julianne would like to know, is there any benefit to drinking molecular hydrogen water over regular water?
Tremendous benefit for the people selling the contraptions. Yeah, it's very lucrative.
So that's none of that, or what's that special water?
Just look at water, H2O, pure water is what we're trying to do. And however you purify it, whether it's reverse osmosis or it's distillation or whatever approach you use to get the heavy metals and hydrogenated hydrocarbons and all the other crap out of there, that's going to be good. But water, if you think about what would the purest water would be, just, rainwater, that if the environment wasn't contaminated anyway, and that's distilled water. It's H2O.
Yeah. What is that water? I mean, the people were selling it and making such a big deal about it. I can't remember. They were having
The Kagan water filter system.
Yeah, and these multi-level marketing and these people.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, they make a lot of thousands and thousands of dollars. So it's nothing wrong with the water per se. It's just it's like all the hype marketing, marketing hype.
Right. Okay, here's a question about fiber. And does eating more than 40 grams of healthy whole food plant-based fiber a day promote bloating? And is it unhealthy for somebody who's been a compliant whole food plant-based eater for decades? Dr. Greger suggests aiming for 100 grams of fiber for health. What do you think?
Well, if you have a debilitated gut, you may not be able to take 100 grams of fiber right away. You have to build up. There's a conditioning effect. And it depends on the type of fiber, but soluble fibers are what the microbiome live on. And when you have more or less than ideal for your body, there are potential problems. If there's no vegetable cellulose soluble fibers, what happens is the organisms will end up eating your mucosal lining and whatnot. That's not a good thing. If you have too much beyond what your digestive capacities are, that's usually because you're overeating. You may have gas being formed from bacteria breaking down food that wasn't properly absorbed and digested. So you want to don't overeat, chew your food thoroughly in a relaxed state. Don't eat when you're all stressed out because it'll affect your autonomic nervous system. So you shouldn't be eating while you watch the news or eating while you're talking to energy vampires. Energy vampires, remember, are people that do what they do best, and that's make other people as sick and miserable as they are so they don't have to be feeling as bad by comparison. So you want to kick the energy vampires in your life to the curb, basically, get rid of them. and try to surround yourself with people that they don't all have to be health conscious and eating exactly like you do, but they just have to be kind enough people that they'll tolerate you doing it. Not the kind of people that get upset because you and your thin body makes them feel self-conscious and uncomfortable. And so they'll try to undermine you so that they don't have to feel so bad.
Thanks. This is from Marcia. What do you recommend for vitamin D? Mine is very low. Is there a way to increase it quickly?
Yeah. So quickly would require supplementation. And you can take vitamin D3. There's vegan forms of it now, or you can get the traditional forms that come from lanolin. And the dosing, depending on your situation, may range anywhere from 1 to 10,000 units a day. But you want to be careful because it is fat soluble. So you want to take enough to get back to normal levels, but not too much because too much vitamin D can be toxic and a problem. The best way to get vitamin D is the sun. But you have to live in an area where the sun's hot enough to actually make vitamin D on the skin. So if you like in Southern California, a significant part of the year you can make D, but in Northern California where I live, you can only make vitamin D about half the year. Even if the sun's out, it's not high enough to give you the UVB that you need to form vitamin D. So supplementation, not uncommonly needed by people that don't get out in the sun enough.
Thanks. All right. Tammy says, I don't have a gallbladder. Do I need to take extra supplements?
No, you don't need to take extra supplements, but you need to be exquisitely careful about your fat intake because the gallbladder acts as a holding sac to hold the bile that myceliates fat. So your ability to digest fat is going to be more limited than people that have a functioning gallbladder. So it'd be that much more important for you to be on a lower fat diet. And so even things like nuts and avocado, you may have to be careful how much of those you would include in your diet and make sure you're eating within your digestive capacities. The other thing about not having the gallbladder for people that continue to eat really high fat diets, that bile has no place to be safely sequestered. So it squirts right into the duodenum, and that's where you tend to find cancer at a higher rate in people that have had gallbladders removed, probably because they're not getting that protection from the constant irritation of the bile. And people eating a greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh-based diet will produce as much as 5 times the bile acids as vegans. And so those extra bile acids, that yellow-green caustic irritating pigment that you think about, constant irritation, constant inflammation, increased risk for cancer. So, if you have a gallbladder removed, just make sure you're eating a whole plant food SOS-free diet. And, we're talking, 15% of calories, not necessarily 40% of calories from fat. So by eating on a lower on the fat, not only will you keep your weight down, but you may allow your digestive function to be improved.
Thanks. This is from Debbie. She says, I'm 67 and live alone. How long is it safe for me to water fast unsupervised?
Yes, you should fast every day for somewhere between 12 and 16 hours. And then if you're going to fast longer than that, whether it's at home or it's at TrueNorth Health Center, the standard is the same. History exam lab, make sure you're a good candidate for fasting, and work with your local doctor in terms of necessary testing. And you can use the coaches from TrueNorth Health to help, deal with any issues that come up while you're fasting. But I wouldn't recommend fasting for people unless they're going to be able to rest, hydrate, and carefully refeed. Because when people do longer fast, that's where they can get into trouble if they aren't following those protocols. And before you fast, go ahead and read our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? Because it'll get you really well educated about all the benefits, but also the legitimate risks and concerns associated with fasting.
Hey, great. So Denise says, can fasting improve issues with the ulnar nerve like numbness?
Sometimes you can get improvement with numbness if the cause of the numbness is inflammation and putting pressure on the nerves. People have problems in the IVFs, in the vertebra, around the tissues, anywhere along the chain, in the elbow. If there's swelling that's causing compression or tightness that's causing compression, sometimes that will improve dramatically with fasting. But if it's because there's been a deterioration in the nerve itself, it may not respond to fasting. So there's some neuropathy that doesn't respond. And we can't always tell. Funny story, AJ. I had a patient who had been suffering with bilateral neuropathy. They couldn't, she'd been to Mayo, she'd been diagnosed, she spent a couple $100,000 on diagnostics. They couldn't really tell her what the cause of her neuropathy was. But the only thing she said all these specialists agreed on, it wasn't diet. When she asked her about diet, no, diet's not, it's nothing diet. And then in preparation for her fast, before she came in, we got her on a whole plant food SOS free diet. And we also asked her to not use any gluten as a routine thing that we do before fasting. Well, before she could even come in, her neuropathy was already resolving. And it turned out she was really exquisitely gluten sensitive. And just getting the gluten out of the diet seemed to translate into improving in her neuropathy. So she was really upset because she had spent all this money and everybody had told her diet didn't matter. And it turned out the only thing that helped her was the very thing that they all agreed wasn't going to be of use.
I never tell when you're actually done. Okay, so here is a question from Arlene. Are there any fasting clinics on the East Coast similar to True North?
Not yet. We're hoping that Dr. Esser may be able to put together a True Northeast, but it hasn't happened yet. Oh, and I have a trick for you, AJ. When the words stop coming out of my mouth, then I'm done.
I know, but it's okay. Thank you. Or you could just say next. Okay. Peter would like to know about the power of corticosteroids to cause weight gain. I recently needed prednisone and gained 50 pounds in a month despite perfect diet. That's a lot. I wonder how much he's on because I take that medicine all the time because I have this really bad allergy to mosquitoes and yellow jackets, and I'm always getting stung, and nothing works
Yeah.
except for prednisone, 40 milligrams. That
Well, I
is,
would suggest you not get stung anymore.
yeah. What do I do? I got
I
stung at
don't know. Have a talk with them.
I got stung at True North by a yellow jacket. We were walking at the cemetery.
Oh, in the cemetery, not at True North. You got
No, oh no,
stung
no.
near True North. We don't
No, no.
allow yellow jackets at True North.
No, I didn't get stung at True North. But when I was done fasting, we took a walk at the cemetery
I
and
love that cemetery. You know, it's right next to the facility where people can get to it without crossing a street. And it's such a nice subliminal reminder to people what's going to happen if they don't cooperate, you know?
that's funny. So did you answer the question of the power of corticosteroids to cause
Well,
gain?
steroids are famous for facilitating weight gain, and they do it both because of the hormonal changes and how fat stores, but also by fluid retention. So my guess is that 50 pounds, at least in part, was probably bloating up with holding a lot of fluid. And so the important thing is to get rid of the need for the long-term steroid use. And steroids can be very helpful, like you found, when you have an acute short-term allergic reaction, they can suppress that inappropriate reaction. But long-term use of these medications can be quite devastating. So, fortunately, you have a condition that only requires a brief exposure, but some people are taking them for autoimmune disease, and then they see the consequences. The good news is if you do the diet, the fasting, oftentimes we can control autoimmune disease without needing to have people on those steroids.
Yeah, I try never to do more than 2 days, but I have to I get like a bump the size of a golf ball if I don't do something.
Yeah. Well, again, the best thing is prevention. It's like everything, the real cure is prevention. And it's once you have it, you got to do what you got to do and deal with it. But, ideally, the best thing is to avoid the exposure to begin with.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Kimberly would like to know if you think the world is changing and beginning to be more accepting of the benefits of fasting and eating a whole food plant-based diet.
Well, there's no question that the number of people that know about fasting now is dramatically different than it was, say when I started out 40 years ago. 40 years ago, fasting was considered criminal quackery, and now it's cutting edge research. And so, it's definitely a different world. Um, and also part of that is the power of social media. There are these things called podcasts that people do, and they get massive exposure. Like, think about this, AJ. In the old days, we would give public talks and talk to 50 or 500 people, maybe. And now, podcasts can have thousands or even millions of views. And so, it would have taken hundreds of years of public lecturing the old way to approximate even a single successful podcast today. So that means information can get out there. Now, the good news is you can get good information out to people broadly. The bad news is you can get a lot of crap information out there too. So it's confusing for people sometimes to differentiate fact from fantasy and fiction. So, you know, it's good and bad. I think more good than bad, though, in terms of our ability to try to educate people about the power of the body to heal itself.
Great. Do you take Medicare?
Yes, Medicare will reimburse for patients that are their exam and their lab, 100% of lab, and whatever the Medicare, depending on the person's deductible, is for the medical exam. What they won't pay is the daily rate at the center. So they won't actually pay the part that's involved in getting well, but they will pay the evaluation and the medical um, um, testing. So it's better than a poke in the eye, but it still doesn't cover the $199 a night that it would cost to have a private room share bath at the center. So it still adds up depending on how long you have to be there.
Well, it's still cheaper than just about any hotel in California, and it
Well,
includes.
it is I think a good value, and people that come don't complain that there's not good value proposition. Because our daily rate includes everything from fees and taxes to meals to fasting supervision, our educational programs, twice daily visits with the staff doctors, and staying at the center. I'm not sure that there's any place that can approximate the value proposition, but it still ends up being expensive for people if they have to be there a long time and stuff. So we're working really hard trying to do everything we can to maximize the value perception, but also to minimize the actual cost. And you can see the changes we've made over the years, and it has made it a somewhat less miserable experience. That's the goal. Make fasting somewhat less miserable.
TrueNorth Health Center, where we make fasting less miserable. All
Less
right,
miserable.
that could be.
We also
So,
have a theme for our food, AJ. TrueNorth Health Kitchen, where we make good food taste not bad.
I love it. You know,
I
if you
should have
weren't,
worked for Madison Avenue, shouldn't I?
I was going to say you'd be a great advertising copywriter. People don't realize that a lot of the famous plant-based books, you are the one that came up with the titles for.
I'm sorry, Chewy was barking in the background, and I didn't hear that last comment.
Oh, well, I said if you weren't a famous doctor helping thousands of people, you could have been an advertising copywriter, and that people maybe don't realize that some of the most popular of the plant-based books you actually came up with the titles for.
Yeah, that maybe that's true, but I think I like what I'm doing now. I find it very rewarding watching people get well and people stay well. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of people staying well. So we're working really hard in trying to do some new research looking at the effect of diet and fasting on healthy people staying healthy. And I think that's actually has the most promise of anything.
Wow. The TrueNorth Health Center, where people get well and stay well, as long
There
as
we
they
go.
follow the diet for at least 50 years. So she's the person that asked about Medicare said, what do you think of a fasting mimicking diet? That's more expensive than going to True North. Isn't it like 500 bucks or
Well,
something?
the thing is about fasting mimicking approaches is they're trying to monetize it, make it a good business model, and also make it safe for people to do where they can do it at home. And so these modified approaches can be very helpful for some people, and they're not something that necessarily you have to be at a place like True North Health in order to do. But like most mimicking approaches, they're mimicking some of the effects. It's not necessarily the same thing as fasting. So when fasting is indicated, I think fasting is probably the best approach. But if fasting mimicking approaches are indicated and can be used, I think they can, be very helpful to people as well.
Perfect. So here's a question on Gilbert's syndrome, elevated bilirubin.
Yeah.
And Landon would like to know, is that considered a contraindication for water-only fasting?
No, it is not. And it is true that in Gilbert syndrome, the bilirubin will be higher always, and it'll go even higher in fasting, but doesn't seem to be associated with untoward events, and it doesn't in any way limit our ability to do fasting.
Okay. But people have to be, don't they have to be ambulatory though to come to True North, right?
Well, we have some ability to accommodate people that are not ambulatory, but depending on what the circumstances are, we do have some rooms that are available that accommodate people that are in wheelchairs or that have some limitations. But in general, we tend to select people that have a very high likelihood of a good outcome. We're mostly interested in working people that are going to have tremendously good results and make us look good.
Right, but it's not like a hospital where they're going to be able to get them out of bed and you know what I mean? I think people need
No,
to.
we don't provide activities of daily living for patients, but some patients do come with aids.
Right. Aids meaning assistance aids, not
Yeah,
not.
they would need to have an assistant.
Yeah.
If a person needs activities of daily living support, we do not provide, nursing care of that type at
Right.
TrueNorth Health.
Not a hospital. Okay,
No.
so Blondie says for athletes, should we eat late at night after working out?
No, what you should always do is not eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed.
Perfect. Swabayu says, does fasting affect osteoporosis? I was recently diagnosed and unsure how to reverse it.
Yeah, so what happens with osteoporosis, we did in that same study where we were doing the DEXA scanner, we found that there was no loss in bone mass during fasting. We were concerned about that because it's not so much the fasting as much as the rest, but apparently the level of activity that we do allow during fasting is enough to avoid osteoporosis. So we don't get a breakdown there. And in fact, the diet, the lifestyle, the exercise, the reduced inflammation often are result in helping people restore bone density. So that's a good thing.
Nice. Well, that we
Okay, AJ, unfortunately, I am going to have to cut us off here because I've got
well,
other.
it's okay because you know why? We're at the end of our questions.
Perfect.
Great. So we'll see you again next month, Dr. Goldhamer.
Okay,
Thank you so
very
much.
good. Thank you.
All right, great Q&A. Thanks everyone for the great questions.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of Chef AJ and Friends. Please come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a special show with Chef Kathy. She's going to be making amazing recipe from her new book. And as always, Friday just happens to be the third Friday of the month, which means if you have more questions for a doctor, Dr. Ron Weiss would love to answer your question in a segment that we call The Doctor Is In, that takes place not at 11, which is the usual time, but at 9 a.m. Pacific time. If you like what you see, please subscribe, maybe give me a thumbs up, and my mailing list, it goes out once a week to tell you who's on the show so that you can submit your questions that way. You get a better chance of getting them answered, especially when it's Dr. Lisle and there's a lot of questions. And that's chefaj.com. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.